So in 1986, Karim Emami, who is considered the first Iranian art critic, posed this question. So what is Iranian about their art? And we look around in this exhibition, what is Iranian about their art? And this is a question that remains very much present, and especially in the curatorial choice of what to pick, why to pick that piece. This becomes a central question that he foresaw 30 years ago. And so we have 14 artists, and they have different styles, different mediums with different artistic expressions, different languages, different backgrounds, ethnic. Some of them weren't even born in Iran, some of them haven't even visited Iran. So these were some of the questions that are raised by this exhibition of what exactly forces them into the rubric of Iranian. There are three, so one of the agendas of the art talk is to bring three representatives from three different categories, important categories within the art scene, the market and the museum, the collecting and patronage practices, and then the artistry and academia. And then to try to approach this question of why is contemporary art so important today, how come it has become so important today, and to try to think through how has contemporary art within the very short period, 20 years, 15 years, has managed to impact the mainstream of academia, the mainstream of collecting and patronage, and the mainstream of museum and the market. And my personal take has been that there's this misconception that because Sotheby's and Christie's were all of a sudden interested in contemporary Iranian art, and that's why we have contemporary Iranian art, and that's why people collect, and that's why museums collect. My argument has been that Iranian contemporary art has been there, has its own momentum, it has been there long before these market categories and academic categories were interested in them. So it's actually the reverse. Iranian contemporary art has its own logic, it has its own priorities, and its own momentum. It does not really care who buys it, in a way. I mean, the market doesn't care what it sells, it only cares whether it sells or not. So I think for us it's very important to remember that Iranian contemporary art has its own history, art history, and so when thinking through the artist and selecting the artist, Roshi and I were thinking through the three categories of absence, memory, and transfiguration. And in all of the work, or in all of these works, can be explained through these categories that are exilic diasporic categories. The absence of something. The absence of the homeland, the absence of the home, the absence of a holistic identity. So many of these artists struggle with the absence. And then we have the category of memory. Many of these artists are struggling with maintaining a form of memory. It could be a childhood, it could be a homeland, and some of them have done amazing work in expressing that. And finally, transfiguration, this constantly transforming something, or being in between two things. Being between Western mainstream avant-garde art and being Iranian avant-garde art. So constantly, actually, artist becomes the translator between two things, two entities, and never really at home in either of them. So again, another syndrome of diasporic presence. And finally, I'm going to end by this was very important for us so that this also becomes a conversation between the community and the museums and the established institutions, mainstream institutions, the academia and private patronage. And so I would like for us to really have a conversation about sometimes difficult things through the insight that these artists have given us in terms of what is the diasporic condition, what is the exilic condition. Emami's question is very relevant today because there's no such a category as contemporary Iranian art. It's a category that the market has created so that it can sell stuff. And some artists are catering to that in order to sell, but otherwise artists like yourselves, and if you look at the big picture, there's only one requirement to be in that category if one of your parents was born in Iran or was Iranian. And so that's, the diverse, varied generations and styles and backgrounds, linguistic and ethnic, and artists who are being put into those categories, they're challenging those categories. Artists like yourself, like Mariam, all of you, and many of the artists in this exhibition are challenging, and that's why for me, art criticism is so important because that's precisely the job of the art historian to say that these artists, they don't want this category.
So as a collector of art, I've always, quite often, I've been asked this question: why do we need to collect art? Art is everywhere. We are surrounded by art. Why spend so much time, so much effort, and so much resources to become a collector? These are actually all very good questions, and I'm going to tell you my experience as a collector and why it has been such an amazing journey has been for my husband and I, and how much we've learned through this amazing journey that we've taken together. At the beginning, the art scene of Tehran during the late 60s and 70s was nothing compared to the vibrant scene of the present moment, whereby my understanding is that there are close to 200 galleries in the city of Tehran alone, and it may be growing by the day. Then it was just a limited number of galleries and a limited number of exhibitions, and we would go to almost all of them. At the beginning, because since we were both so passionate about it, we started buying prints, simply because then we couldn't afford buying originals. I remember that the first original work of art that we bought was by a young artist by the name of Sadegh Tabrizi. When we bought this work, we knew nothing about Mr. Tabrizi. We just loved his work, it appealed to us, and then at the time we thought that, well, it's going to look so beautiful on the particular wall that we had in mind in the house. Later on, of course, we learned about Mr. Tabrizi, and we learned about his association with a group of artists that had termed the art that they had produced as art of the Saqakhani. Mr. Tabrizi's work is amongst a handful of belongings that we have with us from our previous life in Iran, from pre-exile time in Iran. And emotionally and without any doubt, it is one of the most important works of art personally for us. because every time that we look at it, it takes us back to our country, to our home, to our youth, to our experiences, and just to our life pre-exile. I must tell you that the first decade and a half after the revolution was a very, very difficult time for all Iranians in exile. Not only did they have to come with the reality, eventually, that America is going to be their home, away from home, they all had to learn completely new sets of standards, they had to sustain life, they had to find jobs. And so during that period of our life, collecting art or going to art exhibitions was completely out of the question. But when the time is right, we always go back and do what we like to do the most. And we were no exception to the rule. So before we became even more set into collecting, at the beginning we went to as many exhibitions as we could. And here, and actually mainly Europe. So we went and to galleries that we loved, and to galleries that we trusted. It is very important, whenever you acquire a work of art, the provenance of that piece is the most important thing. So, and then eventually you also build a relationship with the gallery that you buy your art from. And slowly we started buying what we just loved. We never bought for value, for market value.
I come to all of this material from a very different aspect. My career in museums and in the marketplace has been devoted essentially to dead white European men. And so I come to contemporary art because I'm interested in contemporary art, and I think all art historians should be interested in contemporary art. It is the art of our time, after all. So all of these things are kind of a wonderment to me, but I have to tell you that when I started my career, I was in a certain generation that contemporary art was New York. The baton had been passed from Paris to New York, and that's what contemporary art was. And no one thought about anything else. And I remember years ago, I became very interested in a group of artists who worked in Chicago called the Imagists, who worked in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I gave a lecture called What They Don't Do on Broadway. Because essentially this material was unknown. In a world of minimalism, these were artists who were using bright, garish colors, and they were painting figures. So they were completely out of fashion, and therefore completely unaccepted to the museum profession, which was dealing only with European, and then with New York art. So the idea that now this material is being accepted and looked at by everyone, the marketplace and museums. And when I was the first curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art of European paintings. Makes me sound very old, but it only happened in 1980. And there was no, essentially, Islamic collection at all. And certainly no one in the contemporary art department would have ever considered thinking about anything but New York, not even Los Angeles art. You have to keep in mind, even Los Angeles art that we now celebrate and exhibit like crazy, even at the Getty, which doesn't collect after 1900 except in photographs, didn't pay much attention to Los Angeles art. And it was only New York art that you get. If you didn't have the requisite Klein, Noland, Litsky, and all the major artists, then you didn't have it. And I can remember a trustee saying to me, why would we want to buy a piece of green and green furniture, in spite of the fact that we have the most important collection of green and green houses in the world? Because no one, in his mind, no one else would collect this. Why should the Los Angeles County Museum of Art collect it? So that was the kind of attitudes you were dealing with in dealing with contemporary art. Now, those have changed remarkably. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art acquired a fairly important Islamic collection. And the curator, Linda Kamaroff, has been buying contemporary art from the whole of the Middle East, not just Iranian art. And she currently has a current iteration, a second iteration of this group of works of art at the moment, including a piece by this band. So you'll see other being incorporated in the museum, but my objection, and I think there's no reason why one can't bring out my personal objections, is that by putting contemporary Middle Eastern art in the Middle Eastern department, that is the Islamic department, you've kind of marginalized it in a way that I find slightly objectionable. And then why shouldn't it be seen in the context? And whether it falls or succeeds is another issue, but why shouldn't it be seen in the context of contemporary art? Between the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the Getty Museum, there was 11 years I lived in New York and worked for Sotheby's. And Sotheby's didn't used to have sales devoted to contemporary Iranian art at that point, but the world changed, the marketplace, the money shifted positions, and the auction houses were no fools, they went where the money was. At the moment, there is a big interest on the auction houses, now no longer necessarily only in Iranian, but they do African sales now, because the idea is that there are now entrepreneurs in Africa who are buying contemporary African art. And fortunately, the Iranians and other countries that were marginalized before have now been so accepted into the world of contemporary museums, that we no longer necessarily think of these things as marginalized. But institutions still tend to show Iranian and Middle Eastern art at the County Museum in the context of a non-existent, or certainly a non-existent at the moment, Islamic collection, where it might have made more sense to see that contemporary art in the context of Islamic art. That collection is traveling, it is not on view, so you're seeing it in a small corridor, essentially, marginalized from the contemporary art. But that's the nature of museums. They're very slow off the mark to make changes. They're very reluctant to make changes. And so the idea of buying anything that is not in the mainstream, or that another institution has already bought, therefore there's a precedent of some kind for, is often very difficult. I do think that it is changing, though. I think certainly with the photography department at the Getty Museum, which is the only department that collects into the present. Again, the Getty Museum is devoted, quite proudly, to dead white European men, because that was Mr. Getty's interest. But by and large, photographs, which he never collected, are the only field that's collected from the beginning of photography in 1839 to the present. And they are making amends to collect in Middle Eastern, in African, in Japanese, in Chinese, and all other cultures, because the world today is a single culture, and we have to take that into account. The interesting thing for me in many of these paintings is that when I came to the exhibition, I was slightly frustrated by the fact that I don't read Farsi. And therefore, these paintings that are speaking to me, I have no idea what they're saying. Mm-hmm. But then I realized that if you were to buy, say, or own a Richard Prince or a Christopher Wall, all of which are jug paintings in many cases, or even an Ed Ruscha, which has words on it, that only if you read English do you know what those paintings mean. But of course, being totally American-centric, I thought, well, of course, everyone should know what those are, because those are the great artists. So one makes an effort to find out what the words are that are in Farsi for me on these paintings. On the other hand, we look at Japanese calligraphy, Korean calligraphy, and Chinese calligraphy. We have utterly no idea, for the most part, what they're saying to us. We admire them for the formal characteristics that we bring on any work of art. But when there is a word in any language, the artist is trying to tell you something. And if you don't make an effort to try and figure out what it is he's trying to tell you, I think we lose a great deal about what that work of art is about. And so I have found this particular exhibition to be fascinating, and Linda Kamaroff's collection, as she puts it together, to be interesting. And I hope one day, when the new building in Blackman is built, that it will all be incorporated contemporary art in one place, and one will be able to judge the good, the bad, and the indifferent.